And please, Matej, go on chairing this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgio. So I've started recording the event. So as our first speaker, I would like to introduce Matjaž Gruden, who is the Director of Democratic Participation at the Council of Europe. Now, Matjaž is a career diplomat and has held various top positions at the Council of Europe. What makes his current position really interesting for us is that within the reach of his work group, there are both questions of protection of journalists and also of democratic education, or special education of young people for democratic participation. And I think this will be also the topic of Matjaž's presentation, which has a very intriguing title, which is Something Old, Something New, Something Borrowed, Something Blue, a case for a multidisciplinary approach to tackling online hate. So Matjaž, you and all the other speakers have half an hour for your presentation, and at the end we'll have a short presentation discussion. Please, Matjaž.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Matej, and thank you very much for inviting me to this. I accepted with great pleasure, and I hope I will be up to your expectations. As you said, I work at the Council of Europe for soon more than a quarter of a century, turning into a piece of furniture around here. But I'm currently Director of Democratic Participation, which, as you said, brings together our activities in the area of education for democratic culture, our youth cooperation programs, but also our activities in the area of culture, cultural heritage, protection of the environment. And as you have said, I'm also responsible for the platform for the protection of journalists and freedom of media. And as an extracurricular activity, I'm asked by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe to lead the preparation of her biannual report on the state of democracy, human rights, and rule of law in Europe. Couple of disclaimers, not the traditional bureaucratic, I will speak in my own name. I mean, I've been here long enough. I'm not too worried about that. I will own everything outrageous that I'm going to say. Probably won't, but you never know in the heat of the moment. But I will speak, of course, in my own name. It will not be entirely legal. I mean, I'm perhaps the odd one out here in this crowd. I do have a legal degree somewhere from Ljubljana University and from the College of Europe, but I've been, as Matej said, most of my professional life spent in diplomacy and international organizations, so haven't been really practicing that obscure trade directly. But I will be also looking from the legal angle. I mean, I'm sitting just across the street from the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, that is a very important part of the environment within which we operate, and also everything we do in other areas when it comes to the freedom of speech containing hate speech is always related to the primary mission of the Council of Europe, which is the protection of the European Convention of Human Rights. You mentioned already my title, Something Old, Something New, Something Borrowed, Something Blue. You know, this is an old English poem describing what a bride should wear at her wedding day. It was really a little bit of a reaction to the title of the overall title of the conference, Self-Regulation or State Control, which I found a little bit restrictive, reductive, opinionated, maybe, if you don't mind. So it's either self-regulation or state control, probably pronounced with a German accent or Chinese or something, the second one. So I thought I would enlarge a little bit the scope of things that I think need to be looked into when we are considering ways to contain, fight hate speech online. So when I mentioned it jokingly, this title to Matej, he thought it was brilliant. So if you think it's brilliant, it was my idea. If you think it's stupid, it was Matej who insisted to keep it. And I will not now structure my intervention according to this little rhyme. There is, of course, things that are old in this story. There are things that are new. There are also things that we could borrow from others. for blue, I think it's nice there because it stands for perhaps the European flag, both of the Council of the European Union. And I think in the entire equation, Europe has a role to play, especially when it comes to regulation. I'll come to that later. So that's where the blue comes in. I'll start by going back really to the origins. I just read a book from historian Neil Ferguson, Politics of Catastrophe, which he wrote during pandemic about the history of pandemics. And he starts by talking about prehistory. And I think, Yuval Harari also in his brief history of humankind has the same tale about networking, how Homo sapiens evolved as a cooperative ape with a unique ability to network, to communicate and to act collectively, which sets us apart from all other animals. In the words of the evolutionary anthropologist Joseph Heinrich, I'm quoting from the book now, you probably figured that out. We are not simply bigger-brained, less hairy chimpanzees. The secret of our success as a species resides in the collective brains of our communities, Like chimpanzees, but on a larger scale, we learn socially by reaching and sharing. According to the evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar, our larger brain, with its more developed neocortex, evolved to enable us to function in relatively large social groups of around 150, as compared with around 50 for chimpanzees. Indeed, our species should really be known as Homo dictius, network men. It is likely that the development of spoken language and the associated advances in brain capacity and structure were parts of this same process, evolving out of ape-like practices such as grooming. In the words of the historians William McNeill and J.R. McNeill, the first World Wide Web, in fact, emerged around 12,000 years ago. Man, with his unrivaled neural network, was born to network. So you see where I'm going with this. 12,000 years ago, we had networking, which transformed us from apes into humans, gave us language. And really the question is how long it took before that language was used to insult each other and the first traces of hate speech appeared. It's difficult to know, but probably I think it was within the first half hour. That's at least what I think. But so we fast forward 12,000 years from that moment, and we get the internet, which those not too young will still remember some 20 years ago was a source of undivided great hope and expectation. And in the early 1990s and early 2000, the internet, worldwide public forum with the possibility to be accessed by anyone, anywhere, was perceived as the perfect place for a wide and open dialogue likely to improve public accountability, political participation, and inclusion. And personally, I think it is still also fulfilling that function. But the operational word in this sentence is also. Because if you fast forward another 20 years, and we're all scratching our heads and struggling how to contain information disorder, and in particular, hate speech online. Hate speech is harmful. It fuels violence, hostility, discrimination, and intolerance within societies. If it remains unchallenged, it will drive human rights abuses further. Hate speech aggravates negative stereotypes, leading for minorities to become increasingly marginalized and isolated, facing abuse, threats, and physical violence. The link with violence is important. Not all hate speech results in hate crimes, but hate crimes always involves hate speech. So we all agree that hate speech is bad, and we all agree that we need to do something about it. The question is what? And first, I think before we do that, we must agree what hate speech is and find ways that will enable us to contain hate speech without causing prejudice to other values, and especially freedom of expression, which is fundamental for a functioning democracy. When it comes to the European Court of Human Rights, as I said, just here across the street, the term hate speech was first used in 1999. But today, there is no authoritative and legally binding definition of hate speech at the European or international level. Numerous definitions of what constitutes hate speech exist, depending on countries, authors, and different cultural and historical contexts and perspectives. Most existing definitions are understood in a broad, open, and flexible way because they're often political in nature and to be able to adapt to new developments. As François Stulkens, former Belgian court at the judge at the European Court of Human Rights, explained, the reasoning of the court is that it prefers to analyze each case submitted to it on its own merits and to ensure that its reasoning and its case law is not confined within definitions that could limit its action in future cases. Therefore, the court is granting a certain level of discretion to member states when it comes to regulate expression and the issue of hate speech, and relies on the margin of appreciation doctrine because of the lack of consensus on how hate speech should be regulated. So, I mean, that is a very important point for everything we say afterwards, both for self-regulation and regulation, is that there is no universal yardstick or Geiger counter, if you want, that would allow us to detect hate speech immediately, instantly, in any circumstances. Say, whoops, you know, here this thing is going too far, we need to intervene. Everything, according to the European Court of Human Rights, had to be examined within the specific set of circumstances and the context in order to establish whether a certain content is still covered by the protection of the Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights or not. So let's first very briefly look at the self-regulation. I'm sure this will also be addressed later. And as I said, I don't want to approach this only from a legal point of view. But in Europe, we have seen several attempts to set certain rules for online intermediaries, mostly relying on non-binding agreements and often in the form of self-regulatory measures, such as codes of conduct, guidelines, and recommendations. But sometimes these measures have raised concerns regarding possible limitations of freedom of expression because they require online platforms to adjudicate on the legality of content, often by relying on automated systems. And as we know, decisions over the unlawfulness of hate speech and disinformation, as I just said, are notoriously difficult. The deployment of algorithms to analyze the content generated on platforms such as recognition and filtering technologies, the diligence and efficiency with which illegal content can be reviewed is also dependent on the financial capacities and resources of respective companies. In addition, these privatized removal procedures may be influenced by commercial interests and lack effective appeals mechanisms. So there's a set of problems that in no way should lead us to eliminate self-regulation. I think it's in many ways a cornerstone of our collective response to hate speech online. But I think we need to be aware of the pitfalls. And we see that in practice. I mean, the most direct way how we experience it, and in a way maybe natural from the point of the companies involved, that they will go deep in order to be safe, that they will remove language with a safe margin in order not to be exposed to possible consequences, fines and sanctions. And we see that very often, how on social networks, the accounts of our people we know and who we never associate or accused of hate speech suddenly are being suspended temporarily. Posts are being swept for reasons that I think a reasonable person would certainly not associate with that. It's a consequence of that safety margin that is built into that system, and I think it is detrimental to the freedom of expression because it eliminates, it excludes speech which is perfectly legitimate. So now, as I said, I will be very brief. To regulation, the European way, the blue way. The European doctrine, based on the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, is that fighting hate speech may involve restrictions to the right to freedom of expression, essential for the functioning of pluralist and democratic societies and the human rights system as a whole. To avoid any abuse of hate speech laws, it is imperative that any restriction is narrowly designed and fully in line with the applicable requirements of the European Convention of Human Rights, as interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights and its case law. And Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights protects freedom of expression with few exceptions and applies to the internet as a means of communication. The core principle is applicable not only to information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb. These three words, I think, are very important. The state or any sector of the population. A democratic society entails pluralism, broad-mindedness and tolerance, even to opinions which are not necessarily popular or well received by society. Nevertheless, this broad-mindedness needs to be balanced with another essential cornerstone for a democratic society, which is tolerance and respect for equal dignity of all human beings. Accordingly, the court has ruled that freedom of expression does not apply to forms of expressions that spread, incite, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance. Expressions of hate must be prevented, if not sanctioned, as long as the limitation imposed on Article 10 respects the principles of legitimate aim, necessity, legality, and proportionality. But again, this is not easy. As we know, definitions of hate speech differ, both in law and in the colloquial use. They can be used as a label very often, same as populism, fake news, and others that are being used indiscriminately, usually to try to disqualify somebody you disagree with. So that's why some are critical of the notion of hate speech and are looking for alternatives. And there's a US-based project, the Dangerous Speech Project US, which is funded by private foundations, even by the Open Society, Soros, don't tell anyone. And it, since 2010, advocates the use of the notion of dangerous speech rather than hate speech, and defines dangerous speech as any form of expression that can increase the risk that its audience will condone or participate in violence against members of another group, and has worked out a methodology that could help us to identify dangerous speech. We have to look at the 5 aspects of the speech. The first one is the speaker. Did the message come from an influential speaker? The second one is the audience. Was the audience susceptible to an inflammatory message because, for example, they were already fearful or resentful? Thirdly, the message. Does the speech carry hallmarks of dangerous speech? There are several such hallmarks, one being dehumanization. You all know that comparing human beings to viruses or animals. Accusation in a mirror, asserting that the audience faces serious and often mortal threats from the target group. In other words, reversing reality by suggesting that the victims of a genocide will instead commit it. And that's a very powerful rhetorical move, because it's actually at the level of community, brings into the argument of self-defense. You have the other hallmarks, such as coded language, speaking, using phrases and words that have a special meaning shared by the speaker and the audience, and others. Context, finally. Is there a social or historical context that has lowered the barriers to violence or made it more acceptable? Examples of these are competition between groups for resources and previous episodes of violence between the relevant groups. And finally, medium. How influential is the medium by which the message is delivered? For example, is it the only or primary source of news for the relevant audience? I think that when we're talking to online, hate speech is also particularly important. So how do the people from the Dangerous Language Project see the difference between hate speech and dangerous speech? Here's what they say. Hate speech is offensive, painful, and even threatening, but it does not very often inspire violence by those who are exposed to it. Conversely, dangerous speech isn't always hateful. It often instills fear, which can be at least as powerful as hatred in inspiring violence. The Dangerous Speech Project is skeptical about prosecution and censorship as a means of countering dangerous speech, especially as a sole method, as it can fail or even backfire in their view. They say it is usually impossible to suppress speech entirely, and efforts to do so can only amplify its message. Removing it from social media sites, for example, can push it into other platforms that act as echo chambers, where people repeat inflammatory messages to each other, making them seem more convincing and therefore more dangerous. A second reason for skepticism is that rules restricting speech are often interpreted too broadly, leading to the suppression of more speech than necessary, the argument that I've already mentioned. I think that they're right to a point. And I think I would categorize that dangerous speech under the heading of something borrowed. But I think we still, as I said, need something blue. We need also the possibility in certain very strictly defined cases, the possibility of intervention and regulation. And in Europe, we are clearly less categorical about the rejection of legal intervention, even prosecution, in freedom of speech. When it comes to racist, xenophobic, anti-Semite speech, for example, and comments denying, disregarding, or minimizing the Holocaust, the court in Strasbourg will systematically reject the claim that the Article 10 was infringed. The court's case law sets a positive obligation for member states to protect victims of hate speech reaching a certain threshold of severity, and most serious cases are dealt through criminal law, whilst less serious cases are dealt through civil and administrative law. So before I really conclude, just an intermediary conclusion, I think that self-regulation or regulation is a false dilemma. I think we need both, but we need to use both with caution, and then we need some more. I think self-regulation is necessary, but it also bears risks. As I said, removing legitimate speech and limiting freedom of expression. Perhaps we need to go further down the production line of hateful, dangerous content and have a real critical look at the economic and technological model that sometimes at best tolerates and even at worst encourages and often benefits from stereotyping, misrepresentation, polarization, and circular hate mongering. Looking at how the algorithms work, how bubbles are created and maintained. And I have a question, I think, for Vittoria, who will speak later, who I understand she's from Facebook, because I just recently came across an article about an internet developer called Lewis Barclay, who created a tool called Unfollow Everything that allows you to immediately unfollow all the friends on all social networks, and with that, basically break the bubble. The extension removed Facebook users' newsfeed by mass unfollowing friends and pages. And the poor Lewis was immediately hit by a cease and desist letter from the Facebook, claiming that this tool violated Facebook's terms prohibiting interfering with the intended operation of Facebook and encouraging others to break Facebook rules. So I'd be interested to hear from Vittoria, how does that look from the Facebook's point of view, and why would it be illegal or problematic to use tools that actually help us to gain greater control in the information that we are accessing to on the internet. I say that with the open mind. As I said, I'd like to hear the other point of view as well. So finally, regulation is necessary, but also needs to be used with caution. That's the Dangerous Speech Project mentions the examples of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, whom political support exploded after his prosecutions for hate speech. We've seen case here in France with Marine Le Pen, who was first accused, and then her conviction was quashed on appeal with hate speech, and that again gave her the status of martyr for truth in the eyes of her followers. We've just following, I wouldn't say fascinating, I just think it's more pathetic attempts of Eric Zemmour, a wannabe presidential candidate in France, who has been twice convicted for hate speech and hate against Muslims. It doesn't seem to be doing him any harm in his presidential ambitions. To the contrary. So there needs to be a caution. The too hasty interventions in the freedom of speech can indeed backfire. But this being said, while caution is necessary because the freedom of expression is so fundamental, I would, of course, side with the European Court of Human Rights on this one and agree that there are instances in which legal intervention, either through criminal or administrative sanctions or fines, is necessary. But again, we come to that problem. Language which meets the Strasbourg Court threshold for legal interference, which must be very high in democratic society, still represents only the tip of the iceberg of what we could call dangerous speech. What do we do with the submerged part? The submerged part that is protected by the Article 10, but still dangerous, problematic. this is particularly important because often the speech that enjoys the protection is being considered, of course, no more hate speech is considered legitimate. Okay, it's considered nice speech. I mean, we see actually interpretations, and Matej would know what I'm talking about, of the notion of talking that if it's not banned, it needs to be respected. We're turning the argument around, where outrageous statement in insults that are attacking certain groups or individuals are being basically supported and in the name of the respect of freedom of speech. When you have the high officials in the country say, I'm not going to react to that, but I have so much respect for the free speech that, you know, I need to respect also what this person said about this person. And that's, I think, the twisted logics, because even if we don't intervene legally, that doesn't mean that we should not counter such speech when it appears in public. So what do we do? I think what we need to do is not only looking at the supply side of hateful content, which is what we do with regulation, self-regulation, but we have to look at the demand side, to use the market economy terms. We have to look at the potential clients of the hate speech and try to intervene on that side. There are two words I'd say. One is counter speech, the other one is education. With counter speech, to define it, it's any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. And it's actually the opposite of the hate speech. Just as influential speakers can make violence seem acceptable and necessary, they can also favorably influence discourse through counter speech. The most direct way it can succeed is to have a positive effect on the speaker, convincing him or her to stop speaking dangerously now and in the future. It can also succeed by having an impact on the audience, either by communicating norms that make dangerous speech, hate speech socially unacceptable, or by inoculating the audience against the speech so they are less easily influenced by it. Everybody can do it. I mean, that's one thing that is about counter speech, that we can do it at home when we are confronted in company with friends, in school, at work, with hateful content, people saying things. And I think that's one important lesson. Everybody can engage in counter speech. That's also something that needs to be learned. So in the Council of Europe, and that's especially in our youth sector, we have developed methodologies and manuals on how to develop counter speech and use it in different contexts. So I'll just invite you to look at there and look at it. There is the entire We Can set of manuals that was developed through the Council of Europe Youth Campaign, No Hate Speech, which finished about 2 years ago. But it's even more important to see counter speech from people in the positions of public influence. Politicians, people, you know, religious personalities, sportsmen, everybody, because they're really the ones that can do it. And what is really worrisome is that, of course, not only very often they do not provide counter speech, they are very often the sources of problematic content. And I think that's could be, we could devote a whole session to it, so I'll just leave it there, but there's a problem. The second word is education, and I promise I'll conclude on that. This is, of course, my trade. One of our priorities is education for democratic culture. I'll just tell you a little story and then I finish. About 2 years ago, we organized a conference of ministers of education of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe on education for digital citizenship. Basically, how to educate young people to give them the skills that allow them to deal with the digital transformation and everything that comes with it. Benefit from the all the opportunities that this creates, and they are enormous, but also be able to be resilient and to respond to some of the pitfalls and threats that exist. And we invited a guy called Gerfried Stocker, who's the director of the Ars Electronica in Linz, one of the oldest and most known festivals that brings together technology and art. It was a little bit of a subversive invitation. The guy has a sort of, you know, an old T-shirt and a ponytail, but he's an excellent speaker and he really knows what he's talking about. And he said you need 3 things if you want to teach kids how to handle the technological transformation. You have to teach them to understand technology. They have to understand the infrastructure of technology. They have to understand code. Not that every kid has to become a programmer. But we very often assume wrongly that young people understand technology because they're using it. That's two different things. Using a smartphone, understanding how smartphone operates, what's in it, is two different things. And Gerfried said, and I agree, that the basics of understanding of the digital infrastructure are necessary in order to give these people this capacity to deal with this. The second is values, very old, going to old, traditional values and skills that are necessary to be an active, engaged citizens. And that's also something that we in the Council of Europe have developed. We call the Framework of Competence for Democratic Citizenship. I won't go and explain it. It's divided in 4 groups: values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, and critical understanding. And then we develop it for different contexts, different age groups, allowing teachers, education professionals to use it in order to transfer to the kids these skills that are necessary and are particularly necessary in the context we are talking about. I mean, when we talk about attitudes such as openness to cultural otherness and to other beliefs, worldviews, and practices, civic mindedness, responsibility, tolerance of ambiguity, those are the attitudes. When we're talking about knowledge and critical understanding, knowledge and critical understanding of the self, knowledge and critical understanding of language and communication, knowledge and critical understanding of the world, politics, law, human rights, cultures, religions, history, media, economies, environment, sustainability. These are all the segments of our framework of competence, which we have also developed for the digital context. And again, I will just allow you to, and I can get you a link into the chat later on, but I won't go into more detail because I think I'm going over my time. Just to say, the president of the Republic of Slovenia, you see, I think behind, you see that I'm a great admirer, once invited me on consultations about hate speech. And when I mentioned the frame of competence, he said, you have 30 seconds to explain, Mr. Gruden, what this is all about. And I said, Mr. President, the competence for democratic citizenship are the things we're trying to transmit to young people, our attempt to transmit to young people the skills and competencies we need in politicians. And I was never invited again to any consultation from the president. I'm still waiting, maybe, but the third thing from Gerfried, I said there were 3, was art. He said we cannot master this without culture and without art. Because of everything, creativity, reflection, comment, dialogue that art provides in a society. So I think it's nice to finish with art. Apes are very intelligent, but they don't do art. And 16,000 years ago, human species began its evolution from primates through networking. And I think it would be tragically ironic if 16,000 years later, our inability to counter the dark sides of the technology would mark the beginning of the journey in the opposite direction. A painful, regrettable, potentially devastating, and much accelerated, I'm afraid. So thank you very much. On that happy note, thank you very much.